Hey, I'm Marvin, and I'm making a 3D platformer about a small rock that can manipulate time. You can wishlist the game on Steam if you want. Last devlog I improved the rolling and leaping mechanic, and this month I built some small test levels, made a system for moving and rotating objects, and composed some music for Pebble. Before starting with the levels, I wanted something simple which the player can use or toggle to interact with something. For example, a lever or a button which opens a door or unlocks something. But I can't use a lever or a button because Pebble neither has hands nor arms. So a simple solution would be a pressure plate where Pebble jumps onto. And I have used a pressure plate in the original game, but a pressure plate is easily overseen because it's a tiny cube on the ground. And it generally is a thing that can be interacted with multiple times, which I only want some of the time. Sometimes the player should only be able to interact with it once. So I had the idea to use a gear. So I modeled it in Blender and modeled a platform for the gear so it has a base to stand on, and made an animation where the gear just rotates around its axis in 360 degrees. This animation gets played when the player rolls into it. And I made another animation where the gear rotates and then collapses. This is used when the gear can only be interacted with once, for example unlocking a shortcut in the level, because I don't want the player to accidentally lose progress when interacting with the gear again. In the future I want to change the model of the one-use gear to seem like it's almost falling apart, with some broken cogs or something. Here you can see how bumping against the gear causes the platform behind it to move. By the way, the system for moving objects works like this. I can place an object into the level, make the path which it should follow, set the general speed, set the speed curve, for example for a slow start and slow end, decide whether it should move back once it reaches the target or stay at the target, and decide whether it should be active from the start or not. If it isn't, it can be activated from a bump gear, for example, and in case you deactivate it while it's still moving toward its target, it moves back to the origin again. So hopefully only the best speedrunners can break this system. Last devlog I said that I finally wanted to build a finished level, and I can tell you one thing that I learned recently: level design is definitely much harder than it should be for me. I have the feeling that it is as if you wanted to paint something, and you've readied your tools, you've researched a lot for a beautiful palette, you have an idea for what you want the viewer to feel when looking at the painting at the end, you've made notes about all the things that you could sprinkle throughout the painting, so you're finally ready to start, and then you sit there, a blank piece of paper in front of you, countless possibilities for drawing the first line. It's just overwhelming, at least for me. Maybe I'm overthinking this, but this is what it feels like to me. Anyway, I block out different areas just to get a feeling of what the level design structure of the game should be like. Here I made a spiraling climb to the top, and maybe some enemies or a boss could try to knock you off the platforms while you're trying to dodge them. Here I made an area that should eventually become a garden near a mountain at the start of the game. And this is a level where I focused on one theme rather than the general environment. And the theme is rotating platforms, which brings me to the next chapter, rotating platforms. I made a simple system for rotating platforms, or rotating objects in general. I can set how many degrees per second and around which axis an object should rotate, and that's pretty much it. It works great in-game, but there was a bug where I accidentally assigned the whole level to the rotating object node. That was a bit weird. Then I wanted a break from level design for a moment, so I wanted to make music. I made it on the Teenage Engineering K02, which is a special sampler that kinda looks like a calculator, and I wanted to test it out. Here's a snippet of how that went. So I made the whole beat on this sampling machine. And once I was finished with it on the sampler, I put it into Reaper, which is my digital audio workstation of choice, where I split it up and just recorded it from the sampler. Then I put it in Fmod, which is a software for arranging adaptive music. I made some regions for different parts of the track. And there's a parameter, in this case a number, that I can change. And once I change it, Fmod waits for the next beat or bar to start and then switches the region associated with that number. This works from any part to any other part. I added it to Godot, and now I can have invisible triggers in the game where the music suddenly changes a bit. This could be happening in special rooms or when traps or enemies are nearby or something. Or I could do something like adding instrument layers the higher the player climbs a mountain. I also added an EQ functionality in Fmod, so when I change a special EQ parameter, the music will get muffled. And then I added the functionality into Godot. And here I can use this when the player dies, for example, and sees the game over screen, or in the future maybe in some underwater areas or in a cave or something. I always implement it for the pause menu though. So when you press pause, you can still hear the music, but the soundscape is a little more on the quiet side, as if the music was coming from a house next to yours. So you can focus entirely on whatever you currently want to do, besides playing the game obviously. When I tested the rotating level, I noticed the environment looked very bland. I remembered how some Mario games had stylized skyboxes, for example in Mario Sunshine's challenge areas. So I made a tileable texture of some gears and I animated it and put it into the level. It looks very bad, I know. I'll return to it in the future, don't worry. So I thought of other ideas that could pep up the environment, and I just put a couple of big rocks into a group, made them rotate around their individual axes with different speeds, and I think that looks good enough for now. Some rotating, floating rocks far in the distance. Next, I polished the splinters again, which are the objects that you can reverse or advance through time. The idea of splinters are that these are objects that glitch through time and don't know what time they belong to. That's why Pebble can manipulate them. So I tried to communicate that to the player by really making them look like they are glitching in the game. Right now they randomly move a bit forwards or backwards along their path, and in the future I also want them to rotate uncontrollably every once in a while. Then I added a new type of collectible, which are timed shards. They appear once you interact with something, like bumping against a gear or moving through a trigger. And then the player has a small amount of time for collecting every shard. If they succeed, they'll get rewarded, and if they fail, they can try again. The last thing I added this month was the ability to recenter the camera. So the camera just points toward the direction the character is currently facing. I mapped it to the right stick button on the controller, R on the keyboard, and the middle mouse button on the mouse. And I also used this feature when there was a game over and I reset the player to the last checkpoint. That's it for this month. Next month I'll focus on game feel. Until then, you can wishlist Pebble on Steam if you want. Thank you, bye!